Well, I'm really interested to hear about how you validate the claims and the efficacy of the device. And I'm very interested to hear about those EPA protocols and why that's important. But first, can you tell us a little bit about the company, Halocill's origins and how that came about?
Sure, I sure can. So our technology originally was discovered in Switzerland, and we had an affiliate at the time who was using the technology over in Europe. And our business founding partner, Chris Ungerman, brought the technology here. And we originally brought it over as, really thinking it would be a good consumer product, but really realized that the disinfection was very, very effective, and that it was really more of a healthcare grade disinfectant. So we went through the registration process to get the registration. The very big difference is that our product is not a wet spray. Okay, there's a big difference between spraying and whole room fogging that's got an EPA registration. Very, very regulated and specific technology and use instructions. So we create a dry fog that evaporates very quickly into a vapor. You may be familiar with vaporized hydrogen peroxide, VHP. Yes. Okay, we have the same efficacy and kill. However, the technology is much less difficult to use. Our material is a 5% hydrogen peroxide solution as opposed to a 35% solution. So it's very easy to work with. 35% peroxide is a hazmat. It's difficult to work with, requires a lot of training. Our product is got excellent material compatibility. There's nothing in it that's going to corrode or harm surfaces. So between that formula and the dry mist application, there's no wetting of surfaces. The vapor fills the space, every nook and cranny, to disinfect every nook and cranny to the exact same sporicidal kill efficacy without damaging surfaces.
Randall, why don't you give us a little bit of your background for our audience, how you got involved in healthcare and how you ended up at Artesia?
Well, that's a long story. I've been in nursing for a little over 40 years. I started in 1979 and going to nursing school in Las Cruces, New Mexico. I had been going to school for about 2.5 years and just about a semester out from getting my bachelor in psychology and trying to figure out what am I going to do for a living with that. And I realized I was going to be a radio sac sales manager with that because you really couldn't use it for anything else. I wanted to be a clinical psychiatric nurse. And when I went to my first clinical psychiatric student nurse rotation, I realized that wasn't for me. So I really enjoyed the medicine and decided that, well, maybe that would be still an outstanding opportunity for me. Trying to get into nursing was interesting. What am I going to do as a middle-class white American male back in the late 70s to get that step up, to get that next opportunity? And so I looked at nursing, and one of the reasons that I chose nursing is I could be a minority, which is a really unique situation for a middle-class white guy. And so that helped me to make that decision. My grandmother was a nurse, and it just seemed like a good opportunity. It was interesting that back in those days, there was very few male nurses. It was about 98% female still. And even currently today, it's still about 94% female. So there's lots of openings. I think males are making headways into nursing. And I think that will change the dynamics of the field going forward as far as being the breadwinner of the family and that type of stuff, as opposed to a female using it as a secondary income for a family. I think those concepts are changing.
I know it takes a village to bring a product like this to market. Tell us a little bit about your team, what kind of resources you've needed to develop this product and how far along it is in the development cycle and maturity.
Well, something I learned from my other startups is that the most powerful thing you can do as a founder is to learn how to lead. Right? That is really the core of being a founder or CEO. And so I got a bunch of my friends from my undergrad. I was like, hey, do you want to come work with me on this? Every single person I met, I would ask them, hey, oh, you're a computer engineer? I have a computer engineering project. How can we make this work for you? And I'm also going to give you professional mentorship and resources. But I think a great way to kind of catalyze this was a year into my project. I was at a conference, and this is when I met my co-founder. His background, I could never afford someone like him. His name's Irwoli Akande. His background's in electronics engineering. He worked for WPG Americas, and I've worked on over hundreds of hardware applications in the IoT field. So how do you win a person over like that to kind of work on your device, right? So I literally just pitched him saying that 95% of people do not wash their hands properly. 80% of diseases are spread through touch. And so he's like, no way. I wash my hands. He goes to home, washes his hands, and it was 14 seconds. And he's like, if I'm not washing my hands, then who really is? Then I brought him in as an advisor. I drive down to Wicker Park here in Chicago every Sunday for 3 hours. We'd meet, and we slowly grew the team by having people who are mentors, professionals, advisors who could mentor the undergrads and use their 5 to 10 hours to kind of strategically grow the team. We've had people, probably close to 100 students, touch this project. Anyone from political science, psychology, computer engineering, computer science. And I think that's what's baked such an equitable and diverse design on our startup generally, and making that process open and accessible to anybody who's willing to do two things, communicate and hold yourself accountable. So that's kind of the composition of our team. Right now, it's me and my co-founder who's now finishing up his MBA over at SMU Cox in Dallas. And we're looking forward to the next stage. In terms of our product development, we are right now getting our first 50 devices out into a school, raising money during the pandemic, also navigating these weird supply chain issues. We would literally design our product and then look to go buy parts like 4 or 5 weeks later and find that they're all sold out or have a 3-year lead time. So we've been redesigning this product over and over and over again, but we finally were able to get our inventory, our supply chain, a new round of funding to kind of get this out into the market. So that's what we're looking at this year, is to just get these out and start growing organically, get these case study data and really actually take this from an academic science perspective. How are we actually increasing rates of attendance? How are we focusing on engagement? And do we get people to wash their hands for 20 seconds?
You have your FDA cleared claims that you've just talked about. What's happening if you're not using Vestex? What should healthcare workers expect from their standard garments? What are you seeing? I'm sure you've done testing in this area.
There are a lot of reasons why, if you look at the rate of injury and illness in healthcare, it's one of the most, if not the most dangerous place to work in this country. The rate of exposure, colonization, and infection amongst healthcare workers is higher than any other occupation, as you'd expect. They're dealing with sick people. The clothing they're wearing today is non-protective. That's just the reality. It doesn't do anything to protect them. And in fact, what the data conclusively shows, and there's more studies than we can quote, that the clothing is a vector. It acquires, retains, transmits pathogens. As you're sitting there, and ask any nurse that works in the ER or anywhere else in the hospital. It's happened to me. I've been a patient before, and I've gotten sick and vomited on a nurse before accidentally. This is you're changing a catheter bag and you spill urine on you. I mean, that's just the reality of the job. It's a tough job.
Yeah.
The unexpected is the norm, the splatters, the spills. But the reality is you can't wear PPE 24/7. It's hot, it's uncomfortable, it's inconvenient. And one of the things we learned in the first SARS outbreak is even when people wore PPE, 40% of the time they inoculated themselves or their clothing, and it caused infections. We saw the same thing with Ebola, where 2 people died when they took off their PPE, cross-contaminated themselves, and got Ebola. I'm not saying that Vestex would necessarily prevent that, but it's always better than the non-protective stuff that people are wearing today. So the question you have is, do I want my clothing to be a carrier and not protect me, or would rather wear something that looks, feels, breathes just the same, except I have an added layer of protection for me, my family, and my patients? And that really is the question that people need to ask themselves.
Well, tell us what makes the UV hammer different from other whole room UV devices on the market.
Yeah, a lot of the products you'll see are stationary vertical towers, either stationary or there's some mobile ones. But when you're talking about UVC, it's really important that you take distance into account. And I know that Steel Shield does that with the electroclave product. And we saw that it was really, there were these long downtimes in these operating rooms because the unit was so far from its targets that you had to overcome that distance, you had to increase time. So it took 30, 60 minutes to turn over these rooms with UVC. And we actually found a way to disinfect an airplane with UVC in less than 10 minutes. And from there, it was very easy for us to translate that to the operating room. So now we can turn over an operating room in 6 or 7 minutes with a UV hammer.
Now, is the airline application something you've commercialized? Is that in the market today? Is that being used on our airplanes today?
Yeah, there are a handful of airlines that are using the machine today. It is now branded the Honeywell UV treatment system, formerly known as Daimler's Germ Falcon.
I know we've got a lot to talk about today, but what can you tell our viewers about yourself and why you're on Clean Talk today?
I'm very fortunate to be able to share some of my story and tips and how we've gotten through this pandemic and other issues throughout my career. But I've had a very colorful career. I didn't start as an infection preventionist. I started as really a marine biologist back in college. And so I've had a very interesting career track that I think a lot of people can look at and take some advice from, or even just take interest in, and realize that you don't always start in a certain place where you think you're going to finish. So.
Well, that's right. And we'll dive into that a little bit. But looking at your bio, Chad, I think we might be brothers from another mother. We have a lot in common. We're both Florida natives. We both went to school in Orlando. We both live in Jacksonville with our families, and both very passionate about infection prevention and infection control. So really appreciate you being on the show today. And really curious to find out, you talked about how you kind of had a change of career paths to get into epidemiology and infection control. And this sounds a little strange, but I have a note here that it has something to do with turtles. Can you tell us about that?
Yeah. So back at UCF, where I was doing my undergrad, I was a biology major and then got involved in the UCF Marine Turtle Research Program. So I thought marine biology was going to be a great path for me. And so indeed, I started doing sea turtle research out in the beautiful Brevard County region of the state. But what we ended up seeing while we're measuring and doing workups on turtles was these turtles started washing ashore with different types of viral tumors. And so when I asked the grad students who were sort of supervising, hey, what is this? They said, well, you should take an epidemiology class. You'll see how diseases move throughout populations. Well, I did that and then really fell in love with epidemiology. And so that led me very naturally into infectious disease control and prevention. And it all really happened because of some sea turtles washing up in Melbourne Beach, Florida.
Well, I want to dig more into those initiatives and the well certification, as well as the safety rating. But let's take a step back. Tell me a little bit more about your background and what drives your passion in this area.
Yeah, I could really, when I think about that, I could think of a specific incident that really clicked a light switch for me. I've been in my background professionally has been in the commercial interiors industry, in business development, and primarily textiles, mostly commercial flooring. And at the time, I had just moved back up from Atlanta to the Northeast to New York, and I was working for a relatively small organization that was in a mid-rise, 8th floor of a mid-rise building. So I walk in pretty much before anybody was there. It was around 6 o'clock in the morning. And as I'm walking into the elevator, a gentleman is walking out with a spray bottle and a rag. And we kind of crossed each other, and I get into the elevator and the doors closed, and I immediately started gagging and my eyes started watering. He was in there cleaning the elevator, as he did every morning, unbeknownst to me, to that extent, but with it must have been a very highly concentrated ammonia product, because I have a relatively strong disposition, but it kind of knocked me out. I came out of the elevator on the 8th floor, got changed. I was still gagging and coughing, and my eyes were red and watering. Yeah, and the long and short of that story is that I started feeling sorry for myself because the presentation went horribly, and I was not on my game. Of course, I was not at my best from a well-being standpoint, and therefore from a productivity standpoint. But at the end of the day, my employer really suffered the most, because there was a missed opportunity from a business standpoint. The meeting did not go well. There was a financial cost to that, because it got me on a red eye last minute. The cost of a luncheon, all these things that go into meeting with and spreading the word of your product was all mitigated because of the inability to really give a top-notch performance. But the guy that was in the elevator with that toxic, highly concentrated substance, he does that every day. He goes in, he does that every day. He goes home to his family every night. And he really did not have the same choices that I had to make a change. And that's really who we think about, who's thinking about these people, who's thinking about their health and well-being. We feel as though that's a social responsibility.